of Finance, Tito Mboweni, tabled the 2021 budget in February with a revenue collection shortfall. Now, observers say it is critical for citizens to hold politicians and state officials accountable in order to create better growth and development. Joining us now is Professor Prof Mbatha, Director of the Institute of Social and Economic Research at Rhodes University. Professor, good to have you with us this afternoon. Now talk to us about what you believe are the main drivers for development. We've heard our president say that we need to move now beyond relief to recovery and development. But there are some key factors that underpin this development. Talk us through some of those.
True. If you look at a number of countries or states, there's a clear pattern that states and governments' capability to deliver on its promises in terms of services to its citizens is key. But coupled with that, you need to have citizens being able to hold the state accountable to its promises. So you find a number of countries where you've got a capable state and a capable government. For example, a country like China. However, it's very limited in terms of how citizens hold the state accountable. Some of the countries would probably include the old South Africa, where the state was very capable, but it was very undemocratic. So you can use those variables to actually group different countries into at least 4 categories, where you've got states like China or old South Africa, as I mentioned, and then you've got states that are both capable on service delivery and are very strong also on democratic accountability through institutions, through the media, through various platforms. So to have those two factors working together, it's really very important, especially now in a time where we see government allocating its budget on specific services, where it has to be held accountable in how it delivers on the promises, and the importance of citizens being able to monitor how this money is spent on the projects that government has set out in its plans.
So, Professor, let's break this down and talk about what accountability looks like, and how does South Africa fare as far as holding its leadership, holding its government to account?
South Africa is great. I mean, especially now post-1984, we've got the right institutions in place. We've got the public protector, of course, if it's working functionally. We've got the courts. We've got a vibrant media. So we've got all the pieces in place to be able to hold government accountable. The only thing that is missing, and it's been deteriorating over time, is the state itself or the government itself to be capable of delivering on its policies, on its plans. I mean, this is partly affected by the way that projects are managed. And that speaks very loudly to the state's capability in terms of human resources that are required to deliver. Also, the issue of corruption. If citizens, as citizens, we're not able to hold a state's official accountable, and courts cannot actually enforce decisions taken to hold officials accountable and imprisoned, that erodes the state's capability to deliver on its promises. So South Africa is doing well on the one side. In fact, it's almost the opposite of what it was pre-1994, where you had a very capable state, a very strong state, which was able to deliver on its plans, albeit to the detriment of the majority of South Africans who could not hold the state accountable. So right now you've got the opposite, the vice versa of the picture. And that's not what we want. We want both factors to be working together in unison, to be able to improve both human and economic development.
And I'd like to go back, Professor, to this definition of holding to account and what accountability looks like. You mentioned there the importance of having a media that is observant, that is vocal, and a citizenry that is vocal too. It looks like South Africa certainly has that, but surely should not the final result, the end result of all the attention and the backlash and the complaining, should not the final result of that be a measure of whether or not an institution or a government is actually held accountable? Is it not the end result that we should be looking at? And what should that end result be looking like?
Well, I mean, almost like the US, you've got a very vibrant media, you've got lobbying groups, you've got very active NGOs, and the same applies in South Africa. You've got a very vibrant media. The same applies here. But just the being able to at least voice out, have the platforms there in place to voice out how citizens are feeling about holding the state account is not enough, obviously, because look at where we are now. I mean, many of the projects that or the policies that have been put in place, government's biggest problem is the ability to implement those programs. So definitely, even if we can complain, if there aren't enough human resources in government or in the state itself, the job is not going to be able to do itself. And part of this has to do with our education system. If the education's output is junk, young people drop out before they reach matric. We've eroded technical training, both at basic education and tertiary institutions. So we're not going to have the skills to be able to deliver for the people that go on to work for the state. So if we don't have that base, this really illustrates that accountability on its own is not going to do its job. So that can't be the end result where we just only have a vibrant media. We've got good institutions in place, whether they're Chapter 9 institutions, we've got good courts, if the state just does not have the skills. I mean, we've allocated now more than 700 billion rands to rebuild our infrastructure. But how are we going to roll out those projects? Who is going to be responsible for reconstructing some of the infrastructure or building the new infrastructure if we are not building the capabilities, human capabilities to do that? And those human capabilities need to be employed in the state for the state to be able to deliver on its promises. So that's just one aspect. And then the aspect of corruption, of course, the media has to be vibrant in ensuring that reports of money being lost into corrupt channels is being reported, and the state itself, the courts, are given enough muscle to enforce their rulings and hold politicians or state officials who've been found to be responsible for corrupt activities put in jail. So that part is not happening, and that's why we find ourselves where we are, with a GDP that's declining, debt that is increasing, and all the other fiscal problems that we're facing.
You pointed there, Professor, to a trust deficit that exists between some South Africans and the government. We are constantly hearing of issues of corruption coming out of the State Capture Commission of Inquiry, impunity for those that some believe ought to get retribution for what it is that they have done. What are the effects of this trust deficit?
So there is a very interesting relationship between government and the media, for example, which is one of the institutions that should be able to enable citizens to hold government accountable. So if that relationship is not a positive relationship, trust breakdown between citizens and government. I mean, we've seen this now with the issue of COVID spending, the lack of transparency, the use of the media in presenting the information around how much is being spent, on what aspects of acquisition of vaccines, distribution, and as well as the administration of the vaccines. If that information is not coming through, if the relationship between government and the media in building trust between itself and citizens is eroded, so people don't trust, in fact, that what government plans appear to be on the surface are actually what they're supposed to be for the government to be able to deliver on its promises. So you find a number of institutions that don't only serve as holding the government accountable, but also institutions that are there to build trust. that if citizens voice out their concerns, they're being heard. And on the other hand, if government broadcasts information about its own programs, citizens are able to trust that that information is accurate, that information, there's no corruption, for example, and the media plays a very important role in ensuring that level of trust is kept healthy or positive between government and its citizens. So the more government, the more people see the results of a delivery in terms of what has been promised at the beginning of the year. For example, with this budget speech, at the end of the year, if we're told that we're going to be reducing our budget deficit, and then we get to the end of the year or the next budget speech, in fact, the opposite has happened. That's one of the sources of mistrust in terms of what is being promised.
And let me come in here for a second, Professor, because you touched on, I believe, something quite important. We have a historically low revenue collection sitting at 212 billion rand. What, in effect, does this mean? Will the Minister of Finance be able to deliver on all the promises that he has made?
So that's one aspect of the problems with the fiscal policy right now, is that over at least 10 years, we've been seeing this budget deficit increasing. This year it's increased to historical heights at more than 200 billion. We put in place an expectation of spending around 2 trillion rands, whilst we've only collected about 1.2 trillion rands, and there's that deficit there. And so where is the government going to be getting that shortfall? Or how is it? It's going to be through borrowing. What does that then do? The borrowing increases on our debt. Our debt also has been increasing over time. When we first were faced with the possibility of going into a junk status, our debt to GDP was at around 60%. This year, we're looking at close to 90%. So how are we then going to be able to go back into being evaluated as a destination for investment? That is the problem with the state not being able to manage its own purse and not being able to keep its promises of reducing both the deficit as well as the debt. And one of the outcomes we've seen around the debt is that this year specifically, many of the private sector investors are letting go of their government bonds. More and more government bonds now are being held by local banks. And the indication there is that the private sector is not confident that government is able of managing its fiscus. So more and more we're moving towards the fiscal cliff. We are just holding our breath, waiting to see when are we actually going to get there, and being unable to get out of the cliff.
Professor, unfortunately, we're going to have to leave our conversation at that for this evening. But thank you very much for your insight as we discuss some of the very pertinent issues of the day, with the Minister of Finance just having delivered his budget speech. That was Professor Prof Mbatha, Director of the Institute of Social and Economic Research at Rhodes University.